Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of our Pharmacy Experts webinar series. The title of our webinar tonight is Digital Therapeutics, the New Frontier. I want to thank you for taking time this evening to join us for the webinar on this very interesting and important topic that describes what digital therapeutics are, the regulatory process for them, indications for their use, and their implications for health systems and for pharmacy staff and practice. My name is Dave Mott, and I am the Associate Dean for Advancement at the UW School of Pharmacy, and I will host tonight's webinar. This event is being sponsored by the UW School of Pharmacy Advancement Office. I want to acknowledge and thank Alyssa Karnecki, our Alumni Relations and Advancement Coordinator, and Anna Reinhart, our Event Coordinator, for their work marketing and producing this event. We had over 80 people registered for tonight's webinar. So before we get started, I want to describe the process we will use for taking questions. First, the chat function is turned off for attendees. Second, due to the number of attendees, we will not be taking verbal questions. Instead, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to type and submit your questions as you think of them. Since some of the questions may be the same across individuals, please feel free to click on the thumbs up icon to upvote for a question. Then during the Q&A session, I will read the questions with the most upvotes for Dr. Sala and Dr. Driver to answer. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a link when the recording is available. We also will be sending you an evaluation for tonight's webinar. So let's get started. Our webinar presenters this evening are Dr. Dalia Sala and Dr. Stephen Driver. Dr. Dalia Sala serves as Vice President of Care Transformation with Advocate Aurora Health Strategy and Innovation Arm, where she leads the design and launch of new digital-first care models that expand access to care. Dr. Sala earned her PharmD degree from the UW School of Pharmacy in 2014. She has served in several leadership roles at Advocate Aurora Health in areas such as retail pharmacy, telepharmacy, remote dispensaries, centralized electronic prior authorization and ambulatory care, specialty pharmacy, mail order, central fill, and compounding pharmacies. She also founded and launched Umwella, an app aimed at empowering patients with digital convenience and price transparency. Dr. Stephen Driver serves as Medical Director of Digital Therapeutics for Advocate Aurora Health. He is also Associate Medical Director for Health Behavior Change with Advocate Physician Partners. Dr. Driver received his medical degree from Ohio State University and earned a Master's of Public Health at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Driver's practice focuses on minimally invasive structural heart valve intervention. Thank you both for joining us tonight. It is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Dalia Sala. Dalia?
Thank you, Professor Mott. We're really excited to be here and talk about this new space in medicine. It's been very cool from my perspective to be able to step into a new department outside of pharmacy within the health system, where I've had the privilege of working with someone like Dr. Stephen Driver here, where we work in partnership along with many others in our organization to build new avenues of care for patients. So to give a little preview of today's discussion, to start out with, Dr. Driver will be giving a bit of background on what digital therapeutics are in the landscape of the industry, as well as a peek into how we at Advocate Aurora Health have positioned ourselves to not only be reactive to new health technology, but very much proactive in staying on top of market and technological trends and seeking out solutions that fit really well for our needs and those of our patients. And then from there, I'll delve a bit further into how pharmacists and extenders, such as technicians, can embed ourselves into this industry and give a brief insight into some of the relevant market examples that I'm hoping will help get us more familiar with DTX and how they can be relevant into our daily practice. So I will hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Stephen Driver.
Thanks so much, Dalia. Are the slides presenting correctly here? First question. Okay, great.
Looks good.
So I'd like to first just thank Dahlia for that kind introduction and Professor Mott. It's an honor to be here. And thank you to Alyssa and Anna for producing and helping to coordinate this. I am a Buckeye actually myself, as you heard, so we can all be friends until September 24th, I think, when Ohio State plays the Badgers. But it's a real honor to be here. So let's start with the why. Why digital therapeutics? Digital therapeutics are a new category of medicine. And from the time that we were peeling willow bark off of trees to use as aspirin, to the development of small molecules, biologics, cell and gene therapy, and ultimately digital therapeutics, you could think of digital therapeutics as just another iteration in the development of the way we deliver care to patients. In other ways, they're completely different. They offer us different capabilities, the ability to augment biology in the ways pills cannot, to remain with the patient in his or her pocket after they leave the office or the procedure lab to monitor and promote adherence, and to make follow-up visits more meaningful. I'll speak from my own clinical experience. I'm an interventional cardiologist, so I often meet my patients when they're at their sickest, having a heart attack. And as you can imagine, they tend to be very motivated to change health behaviors after an event like that. While they're in the hospital, we monitor every beat of their heart. We monitor every medication adherence. We reconcile everything that they're taking. And, we even monitor all of the clinical interactions as well. Yet after they leave, they're generally on their own, and with less medical contact, maybe being seen a couple of weeks later or a month later, old habits reemerge, and patients tend to develop similar habits to what they had before. And until now, we didn't have an opportunity to be in the patient's pocket and help promote adherence and help them in different ways. And for me, that's part of why digital therapeutics matter. So that's the why. I think the what is important as well. Digital health is a broad umbrella term, and I think digital therapeutics and digital health and components of digital health tend to get mixed up. So digital health is a broad concept. It sits at the intersection of technology and healthcare. It includes things like mobile health apps, wearable devices, electronic health records, telehealth, et cetera. Whereas digital therapeutics are tools that actually deliver medical interventions directly to patients using evidence-based software or that is clinically evaluated and either prevents a chronic condition, manages a chronic condition, or treats an acute condition. I always say the most important word in digital therapeutics is therapeutic. It has to treat something. You may have heard about the quantified self movement, followed by the e-health movement, m-health, digital therapeutics. These are all, I think, iterations of the same thing that have changed over time. We want to disaggregate those for what has become a new field in medicine. So how does this differ from digital wellness tools, things that we might be familiar with? There are over 300,000 digital health tools that can be downloaded from the App Store on your iPhone. Those are different from digital therapeutics, and I think that's a key point. Digital wellness tools, for lack of a better word, improve overall health, while digital therapeutic tools prevent, manage, or treat a specific disease or disorder. That definition comes from the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is the main trade group around this, and I'd encourage you to visit their website. There's a lot of great information there. How do you get them? Digital wellness tools are available on the App Store to download. Typically, digital therapeutics must be prescribed by a clinician, or often prescribed by a clinician. So that's a different way for the patient to receive this tool. Digital wellness tools, those are primarily evaluated by user feedback. These are your star ratings. Whereas digital therapeutics demonstrate their safety and efficacy in true randomized clinical trials often. Digital wellness tools are largely unregulated. So in 2013, FDA made a decision that pure digital health tools available on the App Store would be unregulated. And similar guidance has come out of the UK, Germany. Belgium has some very interesting work being done on this as well. But digital therapeutics can receive labeled claims in accordance with the claim that they're making from regulatory bodies, including FDA. Digital wellness tools are often paid for by the consumer, whereas digital therapeutics can be covered as a pharmacy or medical benefit. So these are different, and they're starting to sound a lot like a medicine. And we at Advocate Aurora Health, as the 10th largest health system in the country and soon to be the 5th largest health system in the country, thought, we need to give our prescribing clinicians, pharmacists, patients, an equal amount of confidence in using these tools as they would a medicine, with the idea that these would be used alongside or sometimes instead of medications. And this is becoming really interdisciplinary. This is not something that I as a physician can or would like to do alone. And one of the great joys of my job right now is the opportunity to work with Dr. Saleh on a regular basis with her expertise in pharmacy. So it's really enjoyable, and we look at a lot of different companies. This is a list of current interesting digital therapeutics companies from the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. Right in the middle is Akili Interactive. So we've talked about what digital therapeutics aren't. I think it's really helpful to see what they are. So let me show you this short video. It has some audio. Dahlia, I'm looking at you if you want to give me a thumbs up and just let me know if you can hear it while it plays.
It looks and feels and operates like a video game. What's happening though, every moment of the experience is the user's being thrown challenges and have to navigate obstacles and sensory input that are uniquely tailored through an algorithm to stress the user's attention abilities in a really specific way. It's meant to be constantly stressing where a child's weakest and moving that over time, but doing it in a way that's engaging and has rewards and goals associated with it. It's based on exactly what the weak spots of attentional processing are in the front part of the brain, and is specifically designed to overload that processing system with multiple stimuli. And so the early science was around elucidating exactly what's happening in the brain to people when they pay attention or when they're distracted. And that evolved all the way into our design team testing algorithms to personalize that stimulus for everybody who's using the treatment. The research that we have shows a number of different things. It shows that children benefit in objectively measuring their attention, meaning you can actually quantify how large their attention improvement is, and it's pretty dramatic. Also, parents and clinicians' observation of how those attention improvements are manifesting with their impairments in daily life, we see that increase. What that means is that this is a very different mechanism of action than how a pill works. This is working on the sensory cognitive networks of the brain, and it can be used alongside current treatment. I hope in the next 5 or 10 years, any medical condition where you might want to get a prescription treatment, you might have a digital option right next to your drug option, and maybe you use one or both of those. So I think we're seeing the earliest stages of what I hope is a brand new pillar in medicine.
So I think that really says it well, that in the future, for every clinical indication, you may have a digital therapeutic that can work with your traditional biologic medications or alongside. I think the beautiful thing about modern medicine has been, rather than focus on a treatment that is in search of a problem, we start with the pathogenesis of the problem, think about a mechanism of action that could intervene upon that pathogenesis and help with normal physiology, and then apply that in an agnostic way. And so if that ends up being a pill, or if that ends up being a digital tool, that matters less than following that line of reasoning and then intervening with tools that can be proven to work. So I thought Akili Interactive is a great, and EndeavorRx specifically is a great tool because they've gone through a fairly rigorous amount of research, including things that focus on dosing. You heard him talking about how frequently patients need to use this tool, safety, efficacy, and that all leads up to FDA review and payer coverage, which Dahlia is going to talk more about. But to us at Advocate for Our Health, again, this started to sound a lot like medicine, and we needed to put some structure around it. This isn't the same as saying, try to use MyFitnessPal. We really wanted to think carefully about what tools we put in our patients' hands and how we do that. And that comes down to an interdisciplinary process. So we formed the Digital Therapeutics Council. I'll go to the next slide actually after this, which shows the vision in a bit deeper scope. But the goal here was to create a formulary, if you will, of digital therapeutic tools that can be electronically prescribed in the electronic health record. Just we use Epic. So rather than going to the medication tab, going to the digital tab, prescribing those and linking them directly to the patient's LiveWell app, which is our iteration of MyChart. It's actually a bit more than that, substantially more than that, but it is how the patients interact with us. And there's a number of folks on this council. As you can see, it's very wide. It includes about half clinicians and half non-clinicians. It ranges from legal expertise to HIT expertise to nursing to clinicians. We have pharmacy input regularly. And that's what it has taken to move things forward. And that's one thing I would say to the students is, I have learned more about interdisciplinary work after residency and fellowship than maybe I did during. So learning how to think rather than necessarily memorizing all the material, and there's a fair amount of that in school, but that's been really helpful for me as well. So we pulled together a team to look at these digital therapeutics, and we have a lot of incoming tools as a large health system. And the first thing we needed to do was say, is this a digital therapeutic or not? And this is the algorithm that we use. First of all, we say, is this healthcare related? If yes, the next question is it just generally promoting health, wellness, or fitness? If so, it's probably not a digital therapeutic. If it's mainly a diagnostic tool, it's also probably not a digital therapeutic. However, if it's healthcare related and it treats, manages, or prevents a disease or disorder, that is likely a digital therapeutic. We then get down into all of this, which is actually part of our evaluation rubric, which I'll show you more of, but we're really looking for best practices. There's a lot of tools out there still, even when you boil it down to true digital therapeutics, and we want to use the best ones for our patients. We looked at this with fresh eyes, and we actually just got off a call today with a former CMO of Medicaid, who mentioned that this is, in his opinion, an excellent tool. And it's something that we just thought of with fresh eyes empirically, how would you think about whether a tool is good or not? And for me, it needs to be clinically efficacious. It needs to work. The user has to like using it. So it has to have a good user experience, and there has to be a good strategic fit for our organization. So focusing in first on clinical efficacy, there's one component to that. All of these range from 1 to 5. A 5, as you can imagine, is very high quality evidence from one or more randomized controlled trials. What would earn a 4? A randomized controlled study with some minor study limitations. A 3, and I think this is important, is an observational study that's well done. So even a very well done observational study is not going to earn as many points as a high quality RCT, which I think it makes sense. We see a lot in here in the low quality observational studies, and then something that's just a white paper or pilot data that's going to be lower. So this is different than selling to health systems, different than selling to employers or insurers. I think the bar is higher when you're working with patients. We then actually test everything that we use, and I think it becomes really apparent what's good and what's not when you use it. There's a tool out there called the Mobile App Rating Scale, which has excellent inter-rater reliability and focuses in on engagement, functionality, aesthetics, and innovation. We look at the Net Promoter Score, which is a summary of what their actual users thought of that, and break it down into 1 to 5 scales. And then we look at strategic fit, and I'll cover that more in an upcoming slide. This is the way we look at individual clinical trials. We never want to be in a situation where we have seen a flashy PowerPoint presentation with a really strong point estimate and nobody on the call has reviewed the study behind it to know how much confidence we should have in it. So I'm surprised often at how much evidence-based medicine I use in my day-to-day work, but we think about summarizing the study, especially for the non-clinical members of our team, into population, exposure, comparison, outcome, timeline, setting, and then the main reported finding, rather than just focusing in. So this is a tool that works for patients with uncontrolled diabetes. It was associated with a 0.8% A1C reduction, which is clinically meaningful, anything above 0.5%. But then we said, how confident are we in that observation? If you look here, any observational study would start at a low degree of confidence. If there are any serious limitations, it would knock down the score, and it can come up again depending on if there is evidence of a dose response gradient, for example, and ultimately land at a final quality grade. This is from the Cochrane Collaborative Grade criteria, and it's associated with specific verbiage. So, what we said is the true effect, with this in mind, we should have a low amount of confidence in the effect estimated by the study. The true estimate may differ significantly from the estimate. So it turns out that we looked at 2 different tools, which had almost exactly the same point estimate for their clinical efficacy, but we were more confident in the other tool because this one had 77% missing data. And that's not uncommon in some digital studies, and we need to hold those to a high standard. Next, we all try the tools, which is a lot of fun. I think it becomes really obvious what's good and what's not when you're using it. And everyone receives the mobile app rating scale afterwards. And again, it asks things about, for example, did you find this entertaining? Does it use strategies to increase engagement? Are the buttons in the right place? Does it feel easy to use? And that also, I think, weighs in. If you have a really efficacious tool, but people hate using it, they're not going to use it. Finally, and before I pass it over to Dalia, we think, is this the right strategic fit for our organization? The first thing we think about is, is there a significant need among our existing patients? Could it widen the funnel to potential new patients? Does it align with where we want to go as a company? We have a migration map that we tend to follow. We look at the company stage. So to what extent has the company under consideration been vetted by the marketplace? If something is seed funded with low annual revenues, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it hasn't really been tested, and a lot of the kinks will be worked out over time. On the other hand, a publicly traded company has been vetted by the marketplace substantially. So it depends what we want to do with it. If we're thinking about acquiring the company or partnering with them, we may want them to be a little earlier stage so that there's more equity at a better price to purchase. On the other hand, if we're looking to just use the tool, we probably want to be as far along on that path as we can. And finally, feasibility of implementation. Making these prescribable is, choosing the tool is only half the battle, or I'd say maybe the first step in the battle. After we've chosen it, we need to make it prescribable, get it in the hands of patients, and make sure that they use it. And having the technical infrastructure in place to make that happen is important. With that in mind, I'm going to pass the baton to Dalia and look forward to questions afterwards.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a really great, background, I think, priming us well for this, going into this discussion about what is pharmacy's role. And when we think about how pharmacists and pharmacy teams fit into the world of digital therapeutics, I think a big takeaway that I've had is that at the end of the day, it's not so different from what we're really doing every day in our regular practice, whether you're looking at this from a health system lens, from a community pharmacy lens, or whatever it may be. There's really several core pieces to what we do as pharmacists and extenders that translate in a very clean way to what our provider partners and our patients need from us in the DTX world. So if you play this will work, we take a little bit of time here talking about this list. And what those kind of core pieces of what we already do are and how those translate into the DTX world. I really think that one area where pharmacists, particularly those with existing provider relationships that we're working with, where we can play a key role is by educating the care teams that we work with around what options are available for your shared patients. So for example, let's say you're a disease management pharmacist where you are staying up to date with the DTX offerings that are out there, and you're keeping your chronic care management team, your providers, your nursing teams up to date with offerings like Blue Star RX, Insulia, DNAV for your patients with type 2 diabetes. Or for example, you are in a migraine clinic or an MSK clinic, and you're offering and knowledgeable about vendors like Neurovio, Kaya Health. Maybe you work in a mental health clinic and you're really up to speed about new things coming on the market like Sleepio, Somryst for insomnia, Sparkle RX, Deprexis for depression. So they threw a lot of names out there, but really the point is that just like there are hundreds of drugs for us to know and to stay on top of, digital therapeutics is kind of a new area very similar to that, where it's not really just about knowing that offering and that option exists and that therapeutic exists, but it's also really about understanding how to sift through those and making that knowledge about what works and what doesn't valuable to the patients and the providers that we support. Like Stephen explained, there's a lot out there that's kind of noise in the digital health space. So as pharmacists, we really can play a big role in understanding what's legitimate, what's effective, and what is not. And we'll talk a little bit more about how pharmacists can help evaluate the routes that some of these DTX makers take to bring their products to market, and how we can help inform our, use our clinical understanding to help the teams that we support and the patients that we support access them. looking at some of these other bullet points when it comes to prescribing logistics, I think any of us who have worked alongside prescribers understand that sometimes getting a patient started on therapy is not always as simple as one would think. Getting the therapeutic built into the EHR, getting it added to protocols, getting it added to order sets, these are all things that traditionally are very heavy in from a pharmacy-driven standpoint, and can be applied pretty seamlessly to the DTX perspective. Beyond that, kind of similar to how we are often called upon to handle complex medication counseling, our techs are pulled in to help with navigating payer coverage and copays, or how we're often quarterbacking patients staying on therapy after they've left the doctor's office. These are really all areas where, just like we're doing this for medication therapy today as pharmacists and pharmacist extenders, we can do very similar support when it comes to a digital therapeutic. One thing that I will say too right off the bat, which I think will come into focus as we, as this presentation goes on, is that our technicians, is that actually there's a lot of parallels here between what we're seeing with the world of digital therapeutics and the world of specialty pharmacy. And in terms of how that industry is developing and how that patient journey within getting access to that type of therapy is developing, there's a lot of similarities. And I think just like with how specialty pharmacy developed, it's really important that our pharmacists and pharmacy teams are being at the table as the industry grows. So I think as pharmacists, we learn a lot about drug approval pathways and how things go through different clinical trials there. So I really thought it would be important to spend some time today to briefly cover medical device pathways, because this is actually the route that digital therapeutics that come to market will follow. And knowing the background and how a DTX that you're evaluating for a patient actually came to be and how it's making certain claims for marketing, knowing that is really important so that you can effectively educate the providers you're working with or the patients on what the appropriate place of therapy is for it. So as you see here on the screen, when a digital therapeutic is developed, and assuming that this offering does meet the definition of a DTX, it may, as Stephen had shown earlier, meet one of three different kind of subsets. It could treat a disease, it could manage a disease, or it could prevent a disease or promote health. And based on what it does and the goals of that digital therapeutic maker, they may or may not pursue making this digital therapeutic accessible by prescription only. Often, we're hearing that sometimes these companies will pursue prescription only status in a hope to, kind of make it safer, potentially just ensure that there's more healthcare provider involvement in the administration, similar to when we're thinking about a drug that is prescription only versus OTC. And from there, there's also a decision that the makers need to make as far as, are they going to be pursuing any FDA backed claims when they're marketing the device, and with that, do they need to go through an FDA medical device approval pathway? We'll talk a little bit more about what that all entails and kind of what are some of the marketing terms that you might see used and what that really, what those terms really mean. But I just wanted to point out too that ultimately, regardless of kind of what upstream pathway these DTXs take, there's several different kind of ways that they can get in the hands of patients. There's obviously a self-pay model where a digital therapeutic company might decide to set a cash rate and have just work directly with patients and have them go to the App Store or go to their website to download it and utilize it. Obviously, I think as you might expect, and just like with medications, that can be sometimes cost prohibitive. So there's routes where we're seeing digital therapeutics makers pursue employer coverage, we are also obviously seeing them pursue payer coverage. And what's really interesting, and we'll kind of see play out on the next few slides, is that there has been the thought that getting FDA approval really unlocks more payer access. But what we're seeing is that while that's sort of been the philosophy and the hope and the goal early on in the industry, we're seeing that that's not really shaking out. There are a lot of digital therapeutics that do have FDA backing in one way or another that still aren't necessarily getting access to payer networks, and vice versa. There are therapeutics out there, digital therapeutics out there that maybe have really good outcomes or have found ways to position themselves where they actually are getting payer coverage, even though they haven't necessarily gone through an FDA pathway. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do also want to mention that when we talk about payer coverage here, we're talking about both medical and pharmacy coverage. So PBMs are in the game here, and so are the medical plans. So it's kind of interesting to see how we're really operating on both sides of the border here. This is definitely something that I think we're used to in the specialty pharmacy space, for those of you that have that background, but it's a little bit newer of a concept, I think, for some of us that have historically played in retail pharmacy, for example. So I do also have the provider status bubble here. What's really interesting is we have seen some of these digital therapeutics actually take a different strategy altogether, where they're essentially positioning themselves as an institution or as a provider where they're getting access to payer networks and essentially getting an NPI and being able to care for patients and bill CPT codes when they're handling patient care themselves directly, without necessarily needing to have, you know, a health system physician be the one to use that tool with their patients. So it's kind of a different strategy. I think it's an interesting one that we've seen develop and does keep a lot of the control and frankly, some of the financial benefit within the hands of the digital therapeutic company itself. So definitely one to kind of keep an eye out on. Talking a little bit more here about what the different DTX pathways might go through and kind of the different FDA terminology that might be used. If you look at first the table at the bottom in green, just like with other medical devices, you will hear terms thrown around like we're FDA approved or we're FDA cleared. And I do think it's important for us to know what that means when we're considering where one of these pieces of technology can fit into treatment for a patient. So really broadly speaking, if something does not really need to go through an FDA pathway in order to make the claims that they'd like to make, clinically speaking, you know, a digital therapeutic company might still notify the FDA and essentially get their product registered, but they're essentially exempt. So they're, you know, they're not necessarily having to go through the same rigor that some of these other pathways and levels of approval, so to speak, would require. Different from that, we now have the 510K pre-market notification pathway to examine. And if you see that a digital therapeutic is claiming that it's FDA cleared, it's important to know that that's not the same as FDA approved. 510K pre-market notification typically means that there is a predicate or a predecessor that DTX maker is claiming that their product is substantially equivalent to. And so there's a little bit lower of a you know, evidence and clinical rigor that or evidence-based rigor that the company needs to provide to the FDA. Like I said, they're really mainly focused on ensuring that their product is substantially equivalent to the predicate. We'll look at an example of that on, I think, the next slide. What distinct from that is a company that's saying that their digital therapeutic is FDA approved. Approved means that they've gone through the 515 pre-market approval pathway. This is the one that probably requires some of the heaviest level of evidence and rigor to get that labeling. And this is, as you can see in the blue table, the pathway that is required if you are a class 3 higher risk digital therapeutic or device. So something I think to know that when you see that, they're only really allowed to use that verbiage of FDA approved if they've gone through that pathway. De novo is another pathway that has come into play in recent years, and it's essentially a way for digital therapeutics and other medical devices that are either class 1 or class 2 level risk, so low or moderate risk, not to have to risk getting into class 3 if the only reason that they aren't going through PMN pathway is because there isn't a predicate available. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. What we've also seen is that on some websites or marketing materials, at times you will see companies make claims that they are FDA authorized as a digital therapeutic. So I think it's, want to be smart and recognize that that does not mean FDA approved. That doesn't necessarily mean that higher level of rigor has been reviewed and approved by the FDA. So kind of keeping that in mind, at times that really just means it's gotten FDA clearance and it's only providing substantial equivalence to a predicate. There is also breakthrough status that any, class 1 or class 2 device and potentially class 3 can go through, which is really to go to the FDA and say, hey, this is a breakthrough category. And it just allows that digital therapeutic company or medical device category to have more interaction back and forth with the FDA since it's being recognized that this is sort of new space and new territory that they're paving. And then HDE, humanitarian device exemption, is when there's a very small market size and patient population where it's very difficult to prove efficacy data. So there's a heavier emphasis on safety. So yeah, I'm hoping that this is helpful. Like I said, I think a lot of us in pharmacy, we get really familiar with the drug approval pathways, and DTX has taken kind of an interesting turn that the FDA has categorized it alongside medical devices. Here's a table that hopefully makes what I just talked about a little bit more real. So you see a few different examples of prescription-only digital therapeutics. So if they are prescription-only, you can assume that they've gone through an FDA pathway. And on the far left, you can see that which FDA pathway some of these examples have gone through. What I think is really interesting, you could take a look at those paratherapeutics examples. These ones, the Reset-O and Somryst, actually referenced, as far as I saw, the Reset as their predicate. So Reset came on to the market first as the de novo, which then served as the predicate for now Reset-O and Somryst, which essentially used that in reference when they were filing their 510K pre-market notification pathway. So kind of interesting to see that and understand, what evidence and studies and RCTs have gone into bringing a particular therapeutic to market. As you can see, a lot of behavioral health related digital therapeutics are out there. Paratherapeutics is a big company. Dr. Driver showed us Akili and Endeavor RX for ADHD. Nightwear is another really interesting one for traumatic nightmares. Mahana IBS for irritable bowel syndrome. We've also got a couple additional ones, Relieve RX, Luminopia 1, and Blue Star RX, but there are many others. And it's just kind of interesting to get a sense and keep an eye on what's coming to market and kind of keeping that in the back of your mind as far as how this might be relevant to the patient population that you work with. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when a patient is on their way to using a DTX. Kind of how does that look? So at the top here, there are a lot of different ways that a patient, might go about getting access. Like we've talked about, sometimes it is a prescription-only digital therapeutic that a provider needs to write a prescription for. Sometimes you don't really need a prescription per se, but there still needs to be some healthcare provider involvement. And then sometimes the patient can directly go into the App Store or go right to the company's website and kind of self-initiate enrollment. For the ones that do involve a provider, you can picture a prescription, just like Dr. Driver was mentioning earlier, something that's generated through your EHR sent to a pharmacy, so to speak, or a digital therapeutic company. And there's also enrollment forms that we're seeing are often one of the ways that we see that initiation of therapy can be kind of instigated. And from there, there's really a lot of different ways the patient can get the digital therapeutic in hand. It could be that this enrollment form is sent to the digital therapeutic company and they then reach out to the patient and kind of work with them to get that software set up on their phone or ship them the physical equipment that they then need to use alongside whatever software they're going to be getting therapy from. Or perhaps they're getting a device that hooks onto their inhaler and then, is being used alongside their asthma treatment. But really, there's a lot of different ways in that patient can get the digital therapeutic in hand. I think it's also kind of cool to see that, just like with any other medication, typically there's follow-up, there's side effect management, there's adherence management. And I think there's, the thought that it is important to share back what's going on with the patient when they're using the digital therapeutics back with whatever care team that might have started them on therapy. But I'm sharing this to draw back to the statement I made earlier, which is, if you're looking at this and you have a background in specialty pharmacy, again, you might say and kind of feel that a lot of this looks very familiar. Again, I think that the framework is very similar to what we've seen in the specialty pharmacy world. And really at every step of these phases, there's an opportunity for pharmacists and our technicians to play a big role in making sure that the patient experience goes well, and that the providers are also confident that the patient is staying on therapy and getting the benefit that's intended out of what they're started on, and that the patient themselves is getting the most out of the offering. What I think stands out is some pretty obvious places where we can see that not only do we as pharmacists have a big role to play, but our technicians and our other pharmacy extenders can also play a really vital role here. So we talked about the fact that this is, digital therapeutics, as you would expect, it's software. It's not always the easiest for our patient populations to get set up technologically with what they need. And if a provider is initiating therapy, we also know that they're not necessarily going to have time in the doctor's office to give the TLC that might be needed to get the patient set up. At the same time, there's a need to understand if a patient can afford this option. Is it covered? What's the copay? What does that all look like? And then from there, who's going to stay on top of what, the long-term experience with the patient? Again, a lot of our clinical teams and our provider teams don't have the bandwidth or capacity to do that. Just like with medication therapy, patients are sent out back into their real life after they leave the doctor's office or the hospital. And that's really where pharmacy can step up and become that safety net out in the ambulatory world, where we're able to follow up with the patient, make sure that things are going well and that they're optimized on therapy. And I think, similarly, that role of making sure the patient gets started on the treatment that's that they need, that coverage and costs are not barriers, that setup and initiation are not barriers. These are all very much things that can fall within a technician's role or an elevated technician specialist type role. And I think, just thinking from my perspective as with a health system lens, and somebody that also came from a specialty health system specialty pharmacy lens, I think, there's a lot of ways where I see that one day maybe we have a very similar type of team inside of our health systems that supports digital therapeutics and is kind of handling patients that providers maybe send our way, and we get them started. We make sure that they're successful long-term with the use. And maybe it's not a new separate team, maybe it's just a expansion of our existing specialty pharmacy teams, for example. So I wanted to just give a little, brief peek into some different examples of how digital therapeutics out there today may be accessible from a payment standpoint. So there are different plans that do cover different digital therapeutics, and not all of these have different FDA designations. Not all of them are prescription only. So I have that column here just as a preview for you. So that's kind of what I was referencing earlier, that, that isn't always a guarantee of payer access. And what's also interesting is that you do have a mix between pharmacy and medical plans as far as who is covering the digital therapeutics. Express Scripts has a pretty interesting set of digital tools on their website. They were, kind of early in the game to say, we're going to make sure that some of these digital therapeutics are accessible. So it's definitely worth reviewing kind of their digital formulary, so to speak. You've also got the VA offering coverage for products like FreeSpira for panic attack, panic disorder, PTSD. And then you see different strategies like coupon cards that make the first few months of a treatment affordable. So again, this is very, very reminiscent of how we navigate drug therapy and drug access for the patients that present to us. These aren't things that necessarily can get figured out at the doctor's office during the visit. So again, it's something that we can really step up and kind of play a big vital role in making sure that there are no roadblocks and the experience and access for the patient is smooth. A couple examples, I thought let's talk through a few more. We looked at Endeavor RX earlier with the video, which was really awesome. Wanted to kind of give a few more examples to, again, make digital therapeutics real for you. The ones that I have are more in the mental health and behavioral health space, just because we know that this is, access to mental health care is such a huge problem in our populations today across the country, and certainly where I'm geographically located. So, FreeSpira is an interesting example. I have no relationship with any of these companies, just thought they were interesting. PTSD, panic disorder, panic attack, the one that I mentioned, has VA coverage. Class 2, so it was, pointing to a predicate when it pursued FDA designation. They can say they're FDA cleared. They can't say that they're FDA approved. They do not need a prescription, but it does require the involvement of a licensed healthcare professional to be involved. It's kind of an interesting nuance there. Might wonder what that really means. It appears that, even if a patient wants to essentially self-enroll, the company can provide the healthcare professional that can get the patient, screened and up and running. Got our SIG, to use pharmacy language, and the way that this is used is 17 minutes twice a day for 28 days, and it's used alongside other PTSD treatment or on its own. But I think it's kind of interesting to see too that this one can be used with people younger than 18. So a good option there where maybe other things aren't necessarily as appropriate. Reset is another really interesting one. They have a sister offering called Reset O that is specifically for opioid addiction and opioid use disorder. This one is more broadly for substance use disorder, and it's used with 62 different interactive modules, 10 to 12 minutes a day over 12 weeks, kind of to think about the dosing, if you want to think of it that way. It is RX only. It went through a de novo pathway, as we mentioned earlier, and it has great coverage as well. I think there might be a typo on the slide there with the coverage. Insomnia is a digital therapy, or is a condition that has a lot of different digital therapeutics actually out there. Two of the big ones are Somryst and Sleepio. Sleepio is an interesting one that I thought I would mention because it actually has coverage through NHS in the UK. And I think it's gotten some preferential approvals as well in Germany. In the United States, we are seeing some self-insured employers that are covering it because of the benefit that they're seeing with their employees utilizing it. It's for those 18 and older, not prescription only, can be used without a prescription. And again, it's to be used alongside complementary treatment or on its own. What's I think really cool with all of these digital therapeutics, the ones that I showed and others, is that going online, you can get a sense of what evidence again had to be proven or brought forth by the companies that manufacture these in order to get the different types of FDA backing. Another really great resource is the Digital Therapeutic Alliance, where they've got a catalog of different digital therapeutics that are online. So I would highly recommend, if you want to get really familiar, is checking out their website. Another kind of really big piece of news as we wrap up this presentation, there is a bipartisan piece of legislation that is going through the courts right now. And I think it's one that's important for us to keep an eye on. It is really helping to back prescription coverage, coverage by Medicare and Medicaid for digital therapeutics. This is a really big deal. Like I said, it's bipartisan. Obviously, as you see on the screen here, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance very much backs this, as do a number of other organizations, including pharmacy organizations. It was, it's been introduced into the Senate, into the House. And I think last saw in the House, just last week, there were a few more co-sponsors that have been added to the list. So it's definitely getting traction, but it's something that I think we all would like to see succeed and make it through, because it can drastically help improve access to these non-drug therapeutics that could benefit patients in ways that we just may not have been able to achieve previously. So again, as I mentioned, that Digital Therapeutics Alliance is a great resource. Stephen and I definitely both reference and kind of operate in that world and news and updates very frequently. Another really interesting podcast that Stephen and I both enjoy listening to, and Stephen is actually going to be featured on coming up soon, is the DTX podcast with Eugene Brockovich. I just mentioned this one because it's got some really great episodes. There was a recent episode with Timothy Angst, who publishes the Digital Apothecary, I believe it's called, online. The podcast episode talked a lot about some of the things we discussed today too, about how pharmacy can play a role and what this means for our world. So I highly recommend that, and I find it really kind of intriguing and exciting to stay on top of where this industry is going. So I think that's all that we had as far as formal presentation. Stephen, anything you want to add that I may have missed?
No, I think that was great. I think just opening it up to questions is a good thing to do. Now I may go off of screen share just so we can see everyone. Professor Mott, is that okay?
Yep,
okay.
That's fine.
For anything in the appendix, we'll go ahead and do that. Yeah, I'll just say that Digital Therapeutics podcast hasn't been recorded yet. So if I bomb, then you won't see me. That would be great.
Now we'll know why.
I highly doubt that will happen. A couple questions that I think are kind of interesting. One that came in was, from from a safety profile for patients, what are kind of the vulnerabilities or the implications in terms of safety of patients using digital therapeutics?
Do you want to start, Dahlia, or I can take?
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll think about it from my standpoint. So I'm someone who's constantly, I have a million apps on my phone, and I'll show patients apps on my phone sometimes. And many times I say, geez, doc, that's a lot of apps, you know? And at any one time, because we use all of these, I'll sometimes be trialing multiple different digital therapeutics. And, you know, I think a lot of behavior change digital therapeutics focus on a mix of dietary self-monitoring, physical activity self-monitoring, you know, weight self-monitoring, sleep self-monitoring, something to get the data in, and then layering on top of that goal setting, and then layering on top of that something that will help you actually achieve the behavior change, be that an incentive, financial or otherwise, or often coaching. And if it's something that's focused on behavior change, I don't think that there's a particular danger there. However, digital therapeutics are moving along, and you've seen some of these that, you know, it's a new wave of digital therapeutics. So the first ones were really monitoring and adherence promoting machines. Next came digitizing, you know, tools that we know work, like cognitive behavioral therapy, but making it easier to obtain rather than having to drive in for 16 sessions and take off work, find childcare, you can, you know, jump in digitally. But the newest ones, which are really interesting, the software truly is medicine, and the software is doing something to your body. So anyone who has seen a child look at a phone or look at a tablet knows it's doing something to their brain, and that can be used for good or for ill. And some of these new tools, especially in the mental health space, will fundamentally entrain different groups of neurons and change biochemistry. And I think at that point, all of the traditional things that pharmacists help us with, including medication reconciliation and review, become really important. So like I said, I'll have multiple apps on my phone at any one time that I'm using, and I've been using as many as 4 digital therapeutics at once. And I found myself wondering, you know, would it be safe for me to use all of these together? Are there any interactions that come with them? You know, what if there's a component of virtual health and one quote provider is increasing my Lantus and another one is increasing, you know, my short acting insulin? So how is the left hand going to know what the right hand is doing? And I think it's not novel to digital therapeutics, but it's the kind of rigor that we've applied to all of traditional medical care that, you know, digital tools are going to have to live up to as well. Those are my initial thoughts on it, but Dahlia, I'm not sure if you've experienced any of this yourself in the specialty pharmacy world.
No, I mean, I think you said it really well. It's a different space. It's not interacting with our body chemistry in the same way that a drug is. And so in that sense, it's inherently, you know, we're not at risk in some of the same ways we are with drugs. But what's kind of interesting is that when we do hear sometimes about the drawbacks around digital therapeutics, some of it has to do with things that are kind of novel space for us when we think about therapy, like cybersecurity risk, and other things like that. So that's something I think is different, but I don't have really anything else to add. I think you covered it well, Stephen.
No, that's a good point. I wouldn't have thought of the cybersecurity risk until you brought it up, but that's absolutely true. And I think that's where, you know, that traditional relationship between a prescriber and then a pharmacist, where we're, you know, maybe choosing what we think is best for that patient and then relying upon the pharmacist to, you know, help us with that as well. Now HIT comes in, legal, security, all of that. And Dahlia, you brought this up interestingly in one of our former conversations where, you know, what if I as a prescriber don't know much about digital therapeutics and I prescribe Ambien to help someone sleep, and they show up and you know that they've had a broken hip in the past and they're older, and you say, hey, what about Sleepio? You know, and this may be a safer alternative for you. I would love it if a pharmacist would come in and give a patient an option like that, if I could learn something new and the patient could be provided it. So I think your point about staying up to date in your field is a really important one.
Agreed. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Another question that came in. Have you looked at, this is about patient management and payment. Have you looked at billing CPT codes for remote patient monitoring for digital therapeutics? And are you getting paid for when you use that CPT code?
Yeah, I think it's just,
yeah.
this one hits pretty close to home, I think, for Stephen and I actually. Stephen, why don't you start and I'll add on anything that I have to add.
Yeah, I would say, when you think about a digital therapeutic, rarely do I as a clinician think about what I'm going to be prescribing and then how it will be covered. I think about what's clinically indicated. And sometimes I hear back from the pharmacy that the patient showed up and it wasn't covered and they were disappointed. And doc, why didn't you know that? It's all in the computer. And of course we don't know that. That's what we rely on our pharmacy colleagues for. But many of these tools, which are, as Dahlia really nicely pointed out, are regulated by the FDA, but fall into a gray area when they're not necessarily reimbursed in a defined benefit category by CMS. And so sometimes patients, these won't be paid for by them. And patients are in the US and elsewhere are used to their medical care being covered by a third party payer. And so, if you think about, if we saw a patient with diabetes and prescribed metformin, we wouldn't then follow the patient to the pharmacy and pay for their metformin. We might do that if they were in one of our risk-based contracts, like an HMO, but not typically. And so we as clinicians and as health systems, it takes a lot of effort for us to make these prescribable, to make sure we can monitor adherence and use them to their fullest benefit. But for those 70% or so of patients who are in fee-for-service contracts, that's not something we're necessarily making money on or driving direct value from. And so our thought would be to prescribe these digital therapeutic tools via our EHR, get them in the hands of our patients through our LiveWell app, and then have a bidirectional flow of data between the third-party digital therapeutic and LiveWell. Advocate Aurora Health is actually has an ownership stake in a company called Zelf that sits between EHRs and third-party apps and can help with that bidirectional flow of data. And that's where I think an RPM company can sit and help us to ingest that data and make it reviewable and billable. Dahlia, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that part of the process, but I think that's...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so bluntly speaking, we do a really great job of remote patient monitoring, and we use different technology to do that. We're not the greatest at actually billing CPT codes for the work that we do. A lot of what we do in the patient populations that we invest a lot to manage do include our risk-based patients, like Stephen said. And I think everyone knows that you're not necessarily looking to optimize CPT code billing for those patients. You really are just aimed at optimizing outcomes, and you know that that's going to reduce your costs at the end of the day, and that's the benefit. But with CPT codes for RPM maturing, with RTM now out there, so Propeller for asthmas, when I was just looking at, really, it's actually a Madison-based company. Many of you may know that is, device attached to an inhaler, and then there's remote therapeutic monitoring. A lot of those, the reimbursement space is maturing, and we definitely need to get caught up with that, I think, as most health systems do, to say, we're going to keep doing the good work that we're doing, but also see how we can get paid for it on a per visit basis. We've seen different levels, I think, of maturity on the digital therapeutics side, as far as the vendors and their ability to really empower the care teams to do CPT code billing. One of the companies that we worked with, and when I had mentioned earlier that there's companies out there, DTX companies that are actually positioning themselves as providers using NPIs. This is kind of where some of that came to light for us, that there are digital therapeutic companies that have NPIs. They themselves will take on the patient, do the RPM, and bill as a provider for RPM CPT codes. So in that sense, as a healthcare provider that has sent your patient to that DTX, you may be a little bit cut out of the revenue model there. So that's still, I think, a space that's developing and maturing on both sides. We kind of have to make sure to stake our ground at the end of the day for the benefit of the patient above all else.
That's a great way to say it. I think when you think about how does the pharmacist interact with the patient, I also think about how does the clinician interact. So if I prescribe a tool and it's a 16-week intervention, it doesn't help me as much to hear back at the end of the 16 weeks that things were going well until week 8, and at that point the patient fell off the wagon from an adherence plan. Or if I see them back at 4 weeks, I'd love to congratulate them on the progress they're making. So I think it does matter that we bill appropriately for what we're doing. But I also think it can be helpful. There are many tools out there that have their own employed coaches that help to monitor adherence and promote ongoing use, which is so different than a pill. And I think refreshing and great that if people fall off the wagon. If you look at the MI-free clinical trial, patients who have had a heart attack or bypass surgery had all of their medications reimbursed for a year. And even then, I think this was by Blue Cross Blue Shield in Massachusetts, even then at 6 months, only half of them were actually picking up their statins. And nothing really gets your attention like a heart attack. So, digital therapeutics help us to know what people are doing, but the company tries to get them back on their treatments with digital therapeutics if they start to fail from an adherence standpoint. But I think that's where clinicians can partner too. If there's an escalation pathway where someone is using the tool and it's going well, they start to fall off the wagon and they get an automated message that doesn't get them back. They get a text generated from their coach that doesn't get them back, perhaps a phone call or a video call. Nothing really gets their attention back like a message from their prescribing clinician saying, I was really satisfied with how you were doing with this, try to get back on the wagon. And that's something I'd love to do with, pills. I don't know until 3 months later that someone stopped taking their hypertension medicine, 2 months ago, but I could know that in real time about a digital therapeutic. And I think that sort of monitoring is something we should be paid for because it's clinically beneficial.
Awesome.
Great.
One more question. It has to do with access. How will you address the ability of our elderly population to utilize digital therapeutics, or those populations without access to smartphones?
Stephen and I were kind of just having a little friendly debate about something related to this earlier, actually. I actually think this is where pharmacy can play a big role. If you look at a lot of the digital therapeutics that are out there and kind of what their intended process is for patients to get on and using their software or their technology, a lot of it is automated. It's virtually and remotely handled. So patient goes to the app store, downloads something shows up mailed to their door. Maybe someone is messaging them or emailing them. That might work really well for a portion of the population, but for people that need a little more TLC, I think that's where having the ability to go to your pharmacy, to your pharmacist or your digital dispensary, whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's your pharmacy tech digital specialist who can see you face to face, maybe have a phone call with you where they're screen sharing and walking you through with a little more TLC. This is where I think we're critical. Just like we handhold patients in any other mode of accessing their therapy, pharmacy can play a role here. Because I think the digital world is not necessarily easy for some populations to navigate, and the companies are built for scale. These digital companies are often built for scale. They're built for automation, and so we can bring the human element back to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think when I think about smartphone technology, it's tempting to think this is for young, tech savvy, wealthy individuals, but according to a Pew Research study that I cite from time to time, the proportion of U.S. adults who own a smartphone in 2012 and they're over age 65 was about 13%, and that's grown to 61% by 2021. So this is taking off like a rocket ship. So the perception that older adults don't own smartphones is no longer true. And tablet ownership is also quite high in this population. We did some research when I was at Northwestern. I did 3 years or 2 years rather with a health psychologist. And it turns out if you work with anyone who is starting to use a new technology-enabled solution, there's some trepidation and some nervousness called tech anxiety that they have, and that can be measured pre and post, even just a 30-minute session with someone who can show you how to download it and use it. I think installing the native app matters. I had a patient who had come in, had a heart attack. He was over 65. I put a stent in him. He was chest pain free upstairs recovering. And I went up to enroll him in a digital health solution. And he had a Bluetooth device in his ear and he was on his smartphone. And I was like, this is going to be easy, a home run. But, he had to get this from the app store. So he had to remember his app password. We had to go to I forgot and reset his App Store password. Then he had to, receive an email with a call to action link that he could download and start using. And that required him to download the Yahoo Mail client onto his phone, which needed to, delete another app so he had enough space for it. Then reset the Yahoo app password, then get this thing downloaded, include a multi-character password with uppercase, lowercase numbers. And, I think he's has some phobia because I'm hovering over his shoulder. You're going to get this thing right. He maybe but he took 4 or 5 times to get that right. And so it took, like 10, 15 minutes to get this thing on his phone. But once we got the native app installed on his phone and could show him how to use it, he navigated it just like any of our grandmas who are on Facebook, that like all of our pictures first before any of our friends. I think anyone who has seen, an elderly individual use social media app or something like that, anyone can learn these things. And I think they matter more for patients who, lack access to transportation or are socially vulnerable or isolated. And that includes, low SES populations as well. We have to address things like access to broadband if you're going to be doing a video component of the visit. But otherwise, I think these tools are actually more beneficial for older patients and lower SES patients who don't have access to the same sorts of bells and whistles within the traditional healthcare system.
Awesome. All right, well, that is our webinar for this evening. And again, I want to thank you, Dr. Driver and Dr. Slade. What a awesome, really cool topic that we talked about for the past hour. And I also want to thank our attendees for attending the webinar. I appreciate everyone taking time out of a nice summer evening to engage in this conversation. And as I said before, please look for an email with a link to an evaluation survey so we can obtain your feedback about tonight's webinar. Also, please check out the School of Pharmacy's YouTube channel. And by checking out that channel, you can watch our previous 4 Pharmacy Experts webinars. And I think we're going to try to put those in the chat for you if you want to take a look at that link. And other alumni engagement activities, please check out the latest edition of Discover RX, the School of Pharmacy's digital publication. Please consider golfing in the Pharmacy Alumni Association Scholarship Golf Outing on August 18th. And look for information from us about the alumni tailgate and game viewing party on September 14th. And interestingly, that September 17th game, that's going to be a nice warm-up for the Badgers and the Buckeyes on September 24th, you said, Dr. Driver. So again, thank you, everyone. Please stay safe and healthy. Have a nice evening, and on Wisconsin. Good night, everyone.